Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Cyber Incident Response Management. So a little bit about myself, James Turland, one of the cybersecurity consultants here at IT Governance. My background, spent a while at university, came out with a PhD in information security, so really useful from an academic point of view to learn kind of what's out there, what kind of research is ongoing. From there, working in operations for a large company based around industrial control systems, really. So lots of hands-on experience about the risks faced there, which are typically very different to some of the risks you'll see in other organizations, other businesses, other sectors. Since being with IT Governance, picked up a number of qualifications, and some of my work revolves around making organizations ready for 27001, which is the kind of baseline we see at the moment regarding implementing an information security management system. We'll touch a little bit about that later, but it's essentially about setting a bunch of core policies, practices and procedures that essentially outline all activities within the business. Following on from that, I've gone on to teach and acquire the Certified Cyber Risk Management Practitioner and course, which will help in the delivery of this course, and we're going to learn all about what cyber risk is and how we can manage it, things like what events are, what incidents are. Current cyber threat landscape is incredibly important. We'll be looking at some example threats, what those threat actors are, some of those attack vectors, and what kind of attack surfaces are. So essentially a bit of a kind of background of where to start in this whole process. So how do you even begin to tackle cybersecurity? How do you begin to gain some of that cyber resilience, which is effectively what we need? We're now in an area where a breach is inevitable. Unfortunately, it's no longer just a case of having a strong perimeter defense and relying on that. It's a case of being able to proactively defend your organization, have measured responses to the kind of most prevalent threats. We'll discuss what's known as the cyber kill chain, developed by Lockheed Martin, which kind of presents 7 steps in which a cyber threat could manifest itself, could exploit the organization. And we'll look at thinking in the minds of an attacker, so attack, informing defense. We'll take a case study. We're going to be focusing on Target, kind of a bricks and mortar version of Amazon over in the US, a very big organization who suffered a massive data breach a few years ago. And then we'll look at what the actual incident process, incident response process should be according to CREST. So a little bit about IT governance. IT governance started off as first implementer of what's now known as ISO 27001 and built the business on the back of that. Since then, gone on to deliver a number of products, ranges and services, including cyber resilience, governance risk management, data protection, GDPR, lots of familiar standards, regulatory controls, things like PCI DSS, business continuity 22301, 27001, penetration testing services, work around ITIL, PRINCE, project management standards, and other risk management frameworks, and also kind of many bespoke cybersecurity services that you may require. So what's the purpose of cyber incident response management? The purpose is to manage and respond to unexpected disruptive events with the objective of controlling impacts within acceptable levels. So responding to incidents whilst maintaining the business operations. So a business will typically have clearly identified objectives, and it's a case of putting controls in that are commensurate to the risks faced to business assets in order to meet business objectives. And also we need to be mindful that things do go wrong, so it's all about having measured plans. Incident response management does everything possible to minimize the impact of disruptive events, but it's important to remember that it can never prevent the inevitable from happening, which is what I was stating earlier. We're in an era where a breach is inevitable. It's how quickly you can respond to that, how quickly you can get back up and running. And often there's quite a close link between incident response and business continuity. Ability to detect, react to, and recover from security incidents in a fast, planned, and coordinated fashion. resilience, and the success of the organization. So a lot of the standards that you'll see that are out there, certainly things like 27001, Cyber Essentials, SOC 2, NIS Directive, you'll see that there's quite a heavy reliance on logs, so keeping logs, keeping audit trails, evidence trails, which when you tie it in with things like CIRM solutions, for example, it improves your ability to detect. The more information that you have, the easier it is to respond to events that happen within the organization. And also when you're trying to defend yourselves proactively, when you're kind of enacting your incident response plan, you need to be knowing what's going on. So monitoring, and as we'll see later on in the kind of 7-stage approach, we'll see that intelligence is extremely important. And just to shore everything up, that no sector is safe from cyber attacks. All sectors are at risk: government, technology, finance, healthcare, and a myriad of others. And I can only say that through my experience and my work in consultancy, that it's definitely true. I see a number of case studies throughout my day-to-day job, and yeah, nobody is safe. So it's something that nobody can ignore. The objectives are quite simple: suitably prepare for the cyber attacks that organizations are likely to face. It's not feasible to develop step-by-step instructions for every cyber risk threat because they come in countless shapes and sizes and can be difficult to predict. Preventative measures to avoid security incidents and robust practice response plans. And that's probably arguably the most important point here on this slide. It's the fact that having a documented plan, great, that's the first step. But unless you actually enact and test those plans, how do you know that they're effective? A number of times in my previous role, I'd had drawn up lots of plans that I thought, brilliant, that's great. They're based on best practice, lots of the standards. But until you actually enact those plans, you don't realize that, oh, we have a dependency on a third-party provider. Oh, it's a Saturday, they don't actually provide support at a weekend. So it's all sorts of things like that that come apparent as you go through that process. So some definitions that we're talking about, and I've already spoken. Information security event. Now that's different from an incident. An event indicates a possible breach of information security or a failure of a security control. An incident, however, is one or more multiple related and identified adverse information security events that can harm an organization's assets or compromise to its operations. So events could be lots of triggers on the firewall, for example, and then an incident might be that combined with maybe some increased activity on a web server, for example. Incident handling, so actions of detecting, reporting, assessing, responding to, dealing with and learning from information security incidents. So all about how we're handling it. We're going to require all of those kinds of information, all of those plans and policies. The actual incident management itself, so the exercise of a consistent and effective approach to the handling of information security incidents, and that will rely on what I mentioned before, so clear documented plans that have been tested. Incident response is those actions taken, so enacting what we've got documented and tested to resolve an information security incident, including those taken to protect and restore. And this will typically rely on a defined or outsourced or appointed incident response team, who are a team of appropriately skilled and trusted members of the organization that handles incidents during their life cycle. So cyber incident response team or security incident response team, depending on what your organization is, depending on what you can facilitate. So examples of events, so could be system crashes, packet floods, unauthorized use of system privileges, unauthorized access to sensitive data, execution of malware that destroys data. Again, there's no fixed definition. Some of those, depending on what they are, how they manifest themselves, and also your risk appetite, you could yourself define those as an incident which you may wish to look at. Typical examples of an incident might be a denial of service attack, environmental or physical disaster, data loss or theft, virus attack, malware, ransomware, monetary theft, hacking, website attack or defacement, zero-day attacks, cyber espionage, human error. Typically, we've seen a proliferation of denial of service attacks just because they're very easy to do, require little technical know-how, and also these are services which you can simply buy off the dark web anyway. Environmental and physical disaster could happen to us all. Obviously going to be more relevant to organizations that are perhaps based in areas where that's more likely, i.e. on a floodplain, for example. Data loss or theft, nobody's really exempt for that, but it's basically a case of what controls you have. So strong user-based access controls, monitoring, data loss prevention technologies. Hacking, website attack or defacement, zero-day attacks, all linked. A lot of people ask me, how do you guard against a zero-day attack? It's a good question. But at the end of the day, you're typically trying to secure an asset that's fundamental towards a business objective. So let's say, for example, there's a zero-day attack found in one of your perimeter firewalls. You understand the zero-day attack, you can't patch it. What do? So you need to somehow ring fence either the service, maybe change the supplier, the vendor, take the service offline, use another proxy, something like that. So there's a myriad of ways that you can do it, and they will all come into your tried and tested incident response plans. So when we talk about risks, we're thinking typically about assets, and we're thinking about threat targets, agents, and vectors who want to gain access to that asset. So a threat target is simply the asset that is at risk of attack. The agent, also known as threat actor or threat source, an individual or group that can manifest a threat. That can be intentional, unintentional, human or non-human. So it could be inadvertent human error there. It could be automated tools. A lot of those security tools that we use to defend our networks, a lot of the network probing tools, etc., they're equally as useful for adversaries. Motivations may vary from financial to geopolitical. What makes the agent likely to attack? That can also come in the form of who you do business with as well. So it might be you become a target by proxy of that. The threat vector, so the method or actions to which an attack can or will take to attack a target, and there may be multiple vectors for the same target. Threat vector typically relies on exploits, so a piece of software, a chunk of data, or a code sequence that can take advantage of a bug or vulnerability in order to cause unwanted behavior on computer software, hardware, or systems. And typically you'll see a payload, so a part of malware that performs a malicious action, deleting data, sending spam, or encrypting data. I'm sure we're all familiar with WannaCry last year, which obviously used one of the zero-day exploits was the Eternal Blue, which was then used to deliver the WannaCry ransomware. And there's been numerous examples of that being used since, and similar ransomware such as things like Petya, non-Petya being used exploiting 0 days. So who might threat actors be? We could be looking at the kind of serious top end, so nation states typically going down the route of those advanced persistent threats. It may be corporations, so partners, competitors. Here we've probably got well-funded organizations probably posing the largest threat to the organization. However, there's also non-target specific, so as we just mentioned, ransomware, worms, trojans, logic bombs, backdoors, viruses. Most of that we see distributed through email. Why? Because everybody has an inbox, it's always open, so we're reliant on that first wave of technology, maybe monitoring systems, things like Mimecast, for example, to filter that out before it comes to our inbox. But then if it does breach that technology, then we're relying on the human, and then any processes that govern what or cannot be done. Employees, so staff, contractors, cleaners, guards, white collar crime, customers, suppliers. Staff are definitely a threat to the organization. People should do checks on their staff, vetting before employment, etc. Unfortunately, the cleaners, they often get it in the neck and they're the scapegoat. Certainly when I'm down in London, for example, you're in a multi-tenant building, it's the same cleaner that does the cleaning services for all people within that building. Are they open to exploit? Take this USB. Can you just plug this into all the machines as you go around the offices? Can you take some documents from the printer, for example? And also customers and suppliers, and we're seeing increasing kind of shift in many of these standards, and certainly when you get up to the kind of level of SOC 2, for example, where that supply chain risk is a real issue. And in the case study we'll look at later today with Target, that supply chain risk is the very reason they were attacked, that exploit, that vulnerability, that's where it manifested itself. Terrorists, again, political, religious, anarchists. Hacktivists, so could be political parties, the media, enthusiasts. Activists, vandals, general public, extremists, religious followers, or any kind of mixture of them. Organised crime, local, national, transnational, or specialists. There's even evidence in some areas of the world where cybercrime has overtaken the more traditional kind of smash and grab physical crime. Natural disasters, again, fire, flood, lightning, vermin, wind, sand, frost, or earthquake. And there are all sorts of things that we need to be mindful of. Certainly if we're having any kind of disaster recovery capability, that should be one of your first concerns. So threat vectors and vulnerabilities. What's the threat vector? As before mentioned, things like ransomware, malware. One of the main entry points into the organization is through email. So do you have scanning technologies which look at attachments and links? Do you have policies in your information security management system? Do you have technical controls which restrict the use of attachments, for example, .zip files, PDFs, all those sorts of things? Gateway traffic, so anything coming in out of the organization, anywhere where you're bridging onto the internet. Web browsers, so we've all seen vulnerabilities in the browsers, cross-site scripting attacks on websites, all those sorts of things. The ubiquitous USB stick, again, we've got issues there of, are they allowed on the organization? Who's used them before? What could be on that device? Numerous examples in the media of attackers dropping USB sticks in car parks loaded with malware. Human kind of inquisition to have a look and have a look what's on there, plug that into your computer, all of a sudden you've infected your computer. Again, expanding that to removable media, also including mobile devices now. Certainly things like mobile devices. We often connect to lots of different public networks, for example. We're not necessarily assured as to the controls and security on those networks. Typically mobile devices aren't updated after maybe 2 or 3 years. So all those sorts of issues. And then also humans, exploiting the human. Social engineering is a huge threat vector. So there's no point in spending hours, thousands of pounds of resources, however much it may be, on trying to create technical breaches. Why not just exploit the human, go through that phishing email, that social engineering, the vishings through voice, etc. And then vulnerabilities associated with those, so inadequate staff training. So it's not just a case of having training at induction. It goes through the whole joiners, movers, leavers process. So typically you'd want to have staff training at least annually, or any time where there may be a change in position or a significant change in which the business operates, or indeed, like we've seen, the proliferation of kind of larger scale zero-day attacks. So things like the WannaCry, NotPetya, etc. Insecure network gateways, so perimeter firewalls, adaptive security appliances, all those sorts of things. Are we doing third-party penetration testing? Do we have any kind of assurance of the configuration? Are we removing firewall whitelists? Are we locking down ports, etc., when they're no longer needed? All those sorts of things. Insecure browsers, accessible USB ports, accessible device ports, insecure communications, so using encryption when we're sending any information over a public network. And then human weaknesses, training our staff what to look for, training staff to report, not only on what they may see, or also kind of trying to devise a culture where we see cybersecurity as a positive. So not having a blame culture, people should feel welcome to admit if they've made a mistake or feel confident in being able to express that they've seen somebody doing something that isn't right. So I mentioned it earlier, but we're getting onto the cyber kill chain. In the next slide, I'll introduce the 7 stages. So what's the point of it? To know which path the cyber attacker is going to take. So as I said before, it's thinking like the attacker. So attack informs defense. So attacks rarely come through the obvious front door, your gateway firewall. Attacker generally works through a certain pattern, or what Lockheed Martin calls the cyber kill chain. A sequence of stages required for an attacker to successfully infiltrate a network. Each stage demonstrates a specific goal along the attacker's path. So how can it support us? Designing your monitoring and response plan around a cyber kill chain model is an effective method because it focuses on how actual attacks happen. So what you can actually do is think about these 7 stages, which they outline, and we think about specific countermeasures at each stage. So reconnaissance, it could be the harvesting of email addresses, social networking, passive searches, looking for IP ranges, port scans, all those sorts of things. So if we have set up monitoring alerting on our gateway devices, for example, we could be able to see if there's specific traffic or if there's suddenly an increase. Maybe we have defined thresholds that we know when that threshold's exceeded, maybe it invokes some form of response. There's going to be a weaponization, developing an exploit with payload creation, malware, delivery system, decoys. So the attacker will do that reconnaissance. They're then going to weaponize something. So they're going to do something to exploit a vulnerability. The delivery, so spear phishing, infected website, service provider, so identifying that way of delivering what they're weaponizing. The exploit itself, so what is that? It could be activation of something in the system itself. It could be forcing a reboot of a system. It could be executing some other malicious code. Essentially what they're looking to do, or could be looking to do, is establish a foothold on the system, possibly through a third party, as I mentioned earlier. They may wish to install a Trojan or a backdoor, which will allow them to come and go in and out of the system without your knowledge. They will obviously want to try and escalate privileges, do things that they're not supposed to do, perhaps via rootkits, essentially gaming them that persistence on the network. They may establish command and control center. They will then try to do some lateral movement through the organization. Things like we've seen with the Sony breach, attacking one part of the organization, compromising accounts, going through that privilege escalation, and then being able to proliferate through the whole network. Some internal reconnaissance, maintaining persistence, and that internal reconnaissance is really important. A lot of organizations I visit, they focus primarily on the perimeter defenses, but when you actually dig into seeing what internal monitoring they're doing, it's usually quite lax. Often the more robust, the more resilient organizations will have internal firewalls, internal monitoring, intrusion detection systems, all those sorts of things. Then there's going to be an action, so expanding that compromise, consolidating that persistence, identifying targets, and then possibly exfiltrating data that they've outlined previously as being important, or they've discovered through some more of that internal reconnaissance. Things like it could be payment card data, it could be intellectual property, all those sorts of things. So to see that in action, we'll talk about Target. Their infamous breach was discovered on the 27th of November 2013 and began on Black Friday 2013. So obviously, being a retailer, there's going to be a lot of traffic going through their websites and stores on Black Friday. So obviously the attacker's done some homework there. The US Department of Justice was notified on the 13th of December, and Target had a third-party forensics team in place on the 15th of December to mitigate the attack. However, 110 million Target customers had their payment card data and personal data compromised. I think they're over $1 billion in damages now, $1 billion US. The CEO and the CIO were forced to resign. the shares took a huge hit, and I think the plaintiffs were granted class action lawsuits, so they're obviously going to have mounting legal costs on top of that. So, relating that to the cyber kill chain, let's look at that preliminary survey. There's no evidence of how the attackers performed reconnaissance on target, but a Google search brings up Target's supplier portal with a wealth of information on how to interact with the company, submit invoices, etc. So there's obviously a clear lack of governance over third parties. Maybe specific contract suppliers don't have a supplied owner. That probably hasn't been risk assessed in terms of what information they're sharing, how they are safeguarding that information that may be sensitive to your organization. It may disclose some of your inner workings. Compromise of a third-party vendor. It was discovered that attackers target by compromising a single third-party vendor, a refrigeration contractor. A phishing email duped an employee of the contractor, and Trojan was installed on the computers. So something that we probably wouldn't even naturally think of a vector, but here we see a third-party refrigeration contractor being targeted, probably because they are the most likely to be overlooked, or there weren't sufficient controls, which I outlined in the previous point, to kind of monitor their access to your network and systems. So, leveraging Target's vendor portal access. Access to the third-party vendors gave attackers a route into Target's internal network by figuring out which portal to subvert and use as an access point. A malware detection tool was in place in Target's network, which raised an alarm, but it was ignored. So it shows that actually they did have some countermeasures in place, but without effective monitoring, without effective management of that system. So it's no point in spending all this money on these systems if they aren't proactively monitored and also configured for alerting, which should be automated. And also you should have systems in place and a process defining what will happen during out of hours, because certainly in the West we see a lot of attacks coming on that Friday afternoon, whereby if you're not in a suitable position, you probably won't be aware of the attack until Monday morning, when it could already be too late. Gaining control of Target services. Target hasn't publicly released how the attackers undermined the internal Windows servers, but several possibilities can be assumed. One is that criminals used an attack cycle to move laterally through the network using other vulnerable systems. And there could be a myriad of issues there, such as a lack of a robust patching policy. So there could be a number of systems which were open to well-known vulnerabilities, which you can clearly see in things like Microsoft security bulletins, the kind of famous Patch Tuesday, any of the CERT EU, CERT US, any of the vendor-specific threat intelligence reports that come out usually weekly, if not every other week. The next up was Target's point of sale system. So obviously the attackers understood that they do a lot of their business, a lot of money being made through those point of sale systems. So malware code was used to infect the POS systems. This stole credit and debit card information from the memory of the POS devices as the cards were swiped. The stolen data was moved to an off-site file transfer protocol servers and then sold on the dark web. So obviously as well, important thing there is monitoring outbound traffic, not just inbound traffic as well. So what lessons can we learn from the Target attack? Cyber criminals demonstrated extraordinary abilities of exfiltrating data from a complex retail network. The data breach cost Target 18.5 million in a multi-state settlement. And if Target had put in place incident response measures before the attack, it would have addressed the weaknesses exploited and minimized the impact of the attack. So following that, what's been put in place? So improved monitoring and logging of system activity. Yep, most definitely. As it mentioned, they had these systems in place, but they weren't monitoring, they weren't logging, and they certainly weren't alerting, alarming whoever's responsible for the monitoring of that system. Installed the application whitelisting POS systems, so having a robust software catalog of what applications are on the system, and also even down to the level of configuring firewalls, etc., such that only specific applications can talk to other machines on specific IPs, ports, protocols, etc. Implement POS management tools, so the management of the point of sales devices themselves. Firewall rules and policies, as I mentioned. Limited or disabled vendor access to their network, so restricting access to the network based on the principle of least privilege. So if you have a cleaning contractor, then they likely don't need access to any sensitive information on the network, things like approval, purchase requests, all those sorts of things. Disabled, reset, or reduced privileges on over 445,000 target personnel and contractor accounts. That's something that I see in my day-to-day role, is overprivilege, certainly with people moving between departments. People generally inherit permissions and they're never taken away. Kind of good practice dictates that at any time an individual moves, joins, leaves, etc. within the organization, those permissions need to first be understood. So what do they need to reduce, to fulfill their role, to do their duties. Anytime that changes, we need to have some sort of senior management approval to verify whether those credentials are still correct. So it's least privilege, the least number of privileges needed to fulfill their role. Expand the use of two-factor authentication and password vaults. And this is something that we see increasingly now throughout our day-to-day lives, the use of multi-factor authentication. Obviously, just having a password is a kind of single point of failure. Having a multi-factor authentication, something you have, something you are, something you know, any of two of those three, enables us such that if a password's stolen, it still doesn't grant access to the system. And a lot of these two-factor authentication, certainly the kind of token-based things like Google Authenticator, etc., they will notify when somebody's tried to log into a system or service. Typically, it records the time, the IP address, for example. And then train individuals on password rotation, so don't have accounts. Typically things like 90 days, 120 days, depending on complexity, etc., depending on the level of risk, is what we typically would like to see. Complex passwords, upper, lowercase, numbers, letters, all those sorts of things. Also, removing default passwords is a huge issue as well. A lot of network equipment is supplied with a pre-baked kind of vendor supplied password, which is there just because it makes it easier to configure the device. But it's essential that we change those devices and also limit access to those password details. So an incident response plan outlined by CREST is a 7-stage plan. We want to detect what's going on. We want to be able to report on it. We need to be able to investigate it further. We need some triage plan. We then put that into action. We follow our documented recovery plans, which hopefully have also been scenario tested, and then we do a follow-up. So let's have a look at that in closer detail. First of all, we're going to detect, so precursors and indicators, sources of detection, logs. So think about, much like Target had, they had the systems in place, they just weren't being alerted to, they weren't responding to them. So think about what systems we've got in place currently, about what we can enable on them if we don't already have them enabled. Things like checking the firewall for port scans, increased traffic. Maybe we've got networking tools, PRTG, all those sorts of things, where we can monitor hardware utilization on service, for example. If we suddenly see large spikes outside of what we typically deem normal behavior, then that may be an indicator of malicious activity. And also logs. A lot of organizations I visit, they'll keep logs, but it's typically 2, 3, 4 weeks, which unfortunately isn't really good enough. Certainly because most breaches can take months to discover. So the ability to go back at least a year, I would recommend, is really beneficial. Phase 2 is reporting. Date and timestamps, incredibly important. Having all your devices configured maybe to the same NTP server, for example, being able to correlate anomalies across different logs. Think about the physical location of where the attack was taking place, where the attack was possibly coming from, if you're able to do that. The type and sensitivity of the data. So hopefully you will have a data classification in place within your organization. So you'll be able to understand if it was a system or service that's been compromised, you should understand what data resides on those machines. So you should understand the value of that data. You need to be able to know the current incident status. Is it still ongoing? Are all the alerts still coming in? Is the attack still in action? The source or cause of the incident. So again, that's a case of thinking about maybe the location. If it's an external attack and it's coming in through the internet, we can probably start to think about where it's coming from. That's going to rely again on those dates and timestamps and being able to correlate that information. And then a description of the incident. So what's happening? Are we witnessing any downtime on any of our systems or services, increased load? Are we looking at increased traffic outflowing from the network? All those sorts of things. Next step will be to investigate, trying to determine who it is that has attacked, determine what the scope or extent of the attack was, so how many systems were compromised or accessed, for example. When did it happen? And then that's going to rely on us and our ability to have those logs in place, those dates and those timestamps. What was the damage? So can we begin to understand maybe if it was data that was stolen, the volume of data, maybe if it was a database, are we able to understand the number of records that were stolen? Why did they attack? So think about what the motive was. Have we suddenly done something that would maybe present us in a bad light? Have we implemented a new system and we didn't robustly check its configuration, for example? What methodology did they use? So thinking about that cyber kill chain as well, thinking about what did the actual attack do? How did it exploit our systems? How did it penetrate our network defenses? Or was it a human? Was it something non-technical? We need to think about that. And what was the attack focus? So what are they ultimately trying to do? Next stage is that triage. So identify risks and the business impact. So we understand kind of what's going on now. We then need to sort of, and this is where I was talking before, there's a strong relationship between that incident response and perhaps invoking the business continuity plan. So understanding, is this incident isolated? Is it something that we can quickly respond to? Or is it something far more serious and it's actually becoming a business continuity issue? So is it actually impacting the delivery of essential services, breaching SLAs, all those sorts of things? We need to declare that the incident is or has happened. We need to determine some containment measures. So perhaps if we've identified a segment or a particular subnet or a set of systems or services that have been compromised, then typically we'd want to isolate something like that or more proactively monitor to understand what's going on there. That's where the notion of things like a honeypot site comes into effect. Incident classification. So typically we'll prioritize the incident. So a critical, a major, or a minor. And again, that will depend on the level of information that you have. And also that will then determine whether this could be a business continuity issue. We commence action phase process, so some action to begin to address it, to mitigate it. We may need to notify third-party suppliers or clients depending on our baseline, so our legal, regulatory, or contractual obligations. Obviously, if it's a breach of PII data pertaining to European citizens, then obviously we've got a breach of GDPR. If it's a reduction in the delivery of an essential service, then it's a potential NIS directive issue that we need to report to. We need to take some action, contain the incident before it overwhelms resources, outline some containment steps. Obviously, we want to get to the point of eradication. So we want to either get the people off our network, we want to delete the malware, the ransomware, whatever it could be. Also, during this phase, we want to be gathering and preserving evidence as much as possible, such that we can investigate, and then when we come to the follow-up plan later on, we can look at that and we can try and put some countermeasures to ensure that it doesn't happen again. We want to invoke recovery plans. So this is where I was talking about the importance of having kind of documented, tried and tested plans. So if you do have these plans, previous places I've worked, they take the whole network team out for a weekend to a hotel and say, right, you're locked out of all your systems and services. We've had this attack go on. Let's enact our incident response plan. And then all of a sudden you realize that all those things that you had documented, there's actually a number of kind of caveats there where it's not applicable on certain days or regarding certain data, certain types of attacks, which only become apparent when you go through and actually give it a kind of dry run. We want to replace compromised files or put systems back operational, obviously being mindful that things like a logic bomb could be there, so we don't want to simply spin up a system or replace those files and then reintroduce the malware. We need to make sure that our backups, for example, are sanitized. Removing temporary constraints. So obviously we initially will probably put in some very quick fixes which allow us to meet our business objectives, allow the business to continue, but they're probably not optimal. So we need to look at getting back to that kind of business as usual approach. Things like resetting passwords, installing patches, tightening network perimeter security. They're pretty much quick wins. They're obvious things to do. Double check that it wasn't due to maybe a lapse in the patching policy, patching regime. Anything we then bring back online, we'll obviously want to test third-party CREST certified penetration testing, for example, vulnerability testing, or expert advice around the configuration of specific systems, web service, for example. And we want to confirm the integrity of business systems and controls. And finally, and also one of the most important, is to learn and improve following an incident. So do that analysis, that root cause identification. So really get to the bottom of how and why it happened. And again, that's where the importance of this kind of logging, reporting, your ability to record what's going on, what you did. You want to ultimately come out with being able to quantifying the business impact, so being able to understand what happened. Certainly when you report it, if you're going to the Information Commissioner, you need to have a thorough understanding of what was done, what data was stolen, how much it was, and then what controls you put in place to assure that you minimize the likelihood of it happening again. A post-incident review, and again, that's going to depend as well on your kind of corporate and certainly your cyber governance structure. So establishing something aligned with 27014 would be a great approach. We need to have sufficient buy-in such that these incident response plans are followed up. We understand why they happened. We're given sufficient resources to put in countermeasures to make sure that it can't happen again. And then also, depending on the level of expertise that you may have, digital forensics, as well as what the incident was. You may wish to go down the route of digital forensics, quite an expert field, so a third-party route may be a pragmatic solution to that. And also you need to think as well about forensics, so cloud forensics in the cloud, which a lot of services now go down that route. So that involves a lot of complexities, obviously because you're on shared infrastructure, but it's something you need to think about and plan for. So with IT governance, we offer a lot of consultancy and help around all of the things that we've mentioned. Obviously, based on some of the best practice around 27035, which is risk management within cybersecurity, 22301, which is the international standard for business continuity. We offer the Incident Response Management Foundation training course, which if you'd like to hear me talk more, you can do so at that venue. We do the Cyber Incident Response Management Consultancy. We do our Cyber Health Check Consultancy, which is a thorough assessment of your current IT estate. So we'll be looking at both the non-technical and the technical, doing third-party penetration testing, vulnerability checks of your systems and services. And it's a really good, quick service which can help you to understand the most prevalent threats and risks to your organization. We have the Cyber Resilience Toolkit, and we have a number of cybersecurity books which you can browse through at your leisure. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so on any of those numbers or platforms. And so the final section, I can't see any questions, but if anybody has some questions, please feel free to type them and I will answer them. Okay, I had a question. So what's a zero-day attack? A zero-day attack is basically an attack which we didn't think was possible. So it's a vulnerability within a system that we did not know existed. So much like the WannaCry example we had, that was an exploit in a zero-day called Eternal Blue, which was apparently stolen from, I believe, the NSA in some of the leaks that happened there. And so typically there's no patch. It's not a case of just going to your Windows Update, for example, and downloading a fix. A fix doesn't exist because it's a vulnerability, it's a flaw that we didn't know existed. I've got another question here. How can you go through the system logs easily? It's a good question. A lot of these logs are very noisy. They generate a lot of traffic. And that's typically one of the reasons why when I say you should keep logs for a year, a lot of people look at me quite funny because they say that's a lot of data. Yes, it is. Certainly things like SIEM solutions, so security incident event monitoring systems, there's a number of them out there. One particular vendor just to the top of mind, somebody like FireEye, you can plug in their service to look at all of these logs and you can configure it and it can monitor all of those logs quite proactively. So yeah, I don't expect that to be a manual process there. But what would be good as well is a lot of these tools, a lot of things like your firewalls, your antivirus, any kind of centralized management platform, they'll often generate reports. So you might wish to get them to generate them every week or so, every couple of weeks, and it would just be a case of looking at them and making sure you do review them. Can you set it so that staff can't plug in USBs to company computers? Yes, you can disable USB usage sometimes in the BIOS. You could also physically disconnect if you take the back of the laptop off. You can also through I believe through Active Directory and user policy, you can disable the use of USBs. And there's also a number of products that you can use. I know Sophos and McAfee and some of their end computer protection suites, their virus scanners, for example. You can monitor, you can disable the use of USBs. You can even whitelist certain devices with given serial numbers, for example. Another thing that's important as well on the use of USBs is certainly restricting access on things like servers. Appreciate that you may need to use USBs on servers for administrative purposes, but if you do, it's about making sure that you have either some monitoring on that usage or you have kind of robust physical access control so you understand exactly who's going into and out of the building, such that if they're air-gapped, for example, we're not mitigating the use of that air gap by allowing maybe third parties, engineers, for example, to go in, much like we saw with the kind of Stuxnet malware. Can you trace whether a USB stick has been used on your network? Yes, and it will be dependent on whether you have the mentioned products or configurations, as I mentioned. So say, for example, you do have Sophos or McAfee installed on all of your endpoints. As long as you have it configured to alert, then yes, you would be able to monitor whether somebody has put a USB stick into their device. Also, it extends to things, anything USB. So sometimes they're quite flaky. Sometimes you have to be, they need a bit of tweaking, things like keyboards and mice, mobile phones, etc. But it does give you that whole level of visibility, that granularity. If a company operates on a cloud-based platform, what security options do they have to protect themselves aside from the cloud provider? Yep, that's a good question. So certainly, if we take, for example, the kind of the big three, so we look at Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, and Amazon Web Services. All of those organizations are SOC 2 certified, so Service Organization and Controls. And what the SOC 2 certification is basically an attestation of the controls that are in place on the data center, essentially, against security, availability, confidentiality in those respects. So we take that because they have a type 2 audit, which means that they are continuously audited. So those controls should be up to date. They're the largest providers, so we in place trust, but inherently there's always going to be some risk when we put our data into a third party's hands. But on top of that, it's a platform. So what can you do? Anything that you have on your internal network, you could also replicate within the cloud. So you could install internal firewalls between your services. You can obviously segregate your network internally. You can deploy any form of intrusion detection system internally. So just because it's in the cloud, you can just replicate the controls that you would want to have on your own network. If cyber attack occurs, then you have to notify the ICO. How do they find companies if there is a cyber attack? So you'll only have to disclose to the ICO if it's kind of a breach of maybe personally identifiable information, things like payment card data, all those sorts of things. If it was, for example, your intellectual property and it didn't necessarily have an impact on any individual, you may not have to disclose that. How do they find companies? I don't think there's any clear answer to that. What they state are that fines are designed to be proportional and dissuasive, dependent on the controls that you have in place and the size of the breach. So if your organization that doesn't have any clear controls or policies in place to mitigate a cyber attack, then they're probably likely to give you a much higher fine. Whereas if you're an organization that can go to the ICO and say that we had a breach on last Friday, we know that 10,000 records were stolen, we know exactly how it was done, we know exactly which information was stolen, we've informed the data subjects, we've made sure that we've contained the breach from spreading, we've set up our systems and services, we're back up and running, then hopefully they would levy a much smaller fine against you. I think that's all of the questions. Yep, I think that's all of the questions. So if there aren't any more, thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care. Bye for now.